Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. We have made it. We are finally on the chapter where we get to talk all about flow, which, of course, is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, MC, the author of our book. This is his wheelhouse. It's our wheelhouse because we did already the whole series on the flow book. So I think this is going to be just a really great session where we get to revisit those concepts that we went into a lot of depth with in the first series and now get to apply it in this new context of evolution and what we've been reading so far in the evolving self. And Maritza put together an absolutely beautiful presentation for this one. So I'm excited to get it started.
Quick admin note. Do you see the presentation in full screen?
So I see the I see like your back end. I see the presentation, I see the next slide and no notes.
Okay, right. So just a moment. I did it wrong. Apologies. Do it one more time and I'll do it right. There we go. How's that?
That looks beautiful.
Perfect. Okay, so let's get started.
So we're starting, as we always do, just with a reminder of what flow is all about. But in this chapter, we actually get to do the deep dive into all the aspects of flow. But again, just this is an exploration of the original seminal Flow, the Psychology of Optimal Experience, which if you've ever heard of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, MC, as we love to call him around here, that would be the book that you know. This one that we're currently going through, The Evolving Self, is a sequel to that book, putting the idea of flow into context with evolution. So we start here just by reminding you what the definition of flow is all about in this context here. So flow is the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at great cost. You might know this feeling as being in the zone when you're so involved and absorbed in a project that you lose track of time, lose sense of self. But we're going to go through, there's 8 conditions of flow that MC had initially identified, and we're going to even go through all of those as part of our presentation today. So this is the first beautiful slide that Maritza put together here, helping us think about what flow is all about. And this gets us started with the way this chapter begins. So we've been examining the idea of evolution and how, as human beings, we can actively contribute to the future of evolution. And in this chapter now, MC is finally going to connect evolution with flow. He starts with the sentence, helping to shape a more harmonious future is a noble idea, but what's in it for me? Am I to expect virtue to be its own and only reward without any tangible benefits for those who sacrifice satisfaction in the present in order to build complexity in the long run? So this is now really even thinking about what it means for you as an individual actor and agent, why it is to your benefit and what you get out of being an active participant in directing evolution. And MC's answer is going to be that it has all to do with flow, unsurprisingly, perhaps.
Exactly. And just for those of you who may not have walked with us in the first flow book, what you're seeing here in the periphery, these are several different states of consciousness. And as you see there, flow state is in the top right, and that's the state that we would like to be in most often. So that's what you're seeing there.
Exactly. And we're going to have a slide coming up that I think even explains this even more. So we'll get there soon. The idea of the flow channel.
Yes.
So going on here, in order to ensure our own continuation, evolutionary processes seem to have built into our nervous systems a preference for complexity. When we struggle against entropy, we do get an immediate and very concrete reward from our actions. We enjoy whatever we are doing moment by moment. So this is where MC is really starting to make the connection between evolution and flow, starting to present perhaps even an evolutionary case for why flow developed in the first place. And I think it's fascinating that he locates it in this concept of complexity. So in the original flow book, we explored the idea that what flow helps build for us is complexity of the self. And so now MC is tying that idea of developing greater complexity of the self and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from that with evolution.
And this here, what you're seeing is a very fancy way of MC telling us he's answering the questions from before. So when you're asking yourself, what is in it for me? Why should I care? What MC is saying to you, you're not doing it with nothing for yourself. He's saying, he's not telling you necessarily that you need to care, but he's saying, no, you will get an immediate reward. And so this is what he's telling you here. If we're following the flow state, we are getting a reward. It's not like we're doing sacrifice for sacrifice's sake.
One thing I love about this point too is that it connects the present with the past and the future. So this whole book has been all about the past and then the future. The first 5 chapters we read were all about our evolutionary history and our evolutionary past. And the section we're in now is really talking about the future and what we can do to control and direct evolution into the future. But in this chapter, what I see him doing here is connecting past and future with the present moment and telling us that we can get joy, satisfaction, benefit, reward right here and now in the present moment, but in the context of our evolutionary past and directing evolution toward a future.
Right. And another way to think of it is to think of it as the idea that it is possible to be entirely focused in the right now and still be building a better future. So without fretting and stressing about what comes tomorrow, you can build yourself a better tomorrow by making sure today is as good as you can make it, which I love that concept.
Mm-hmm. So now here we're getting into the detailed explanation of what flow is all about, the elements of flow. I think we almost need to read just this whole slide here because this really just sets the whole foundation. And so if you were with us for the original flow book, this section might be somewhat of a review. If not, this might all be brand new, but whether it is just review or brand new, I think it's worthwhile to go over this again and just remind ourselves what flow is all about and what all the elements of flow are. So the main point here says the self is flooded with a sense of exhilaration when we undertake a task that requires complex skills, that leads to a challenging goal. In those moments, we feel that instead of suffering through events over which we have no control, we are creating our own lives. Flow seems to be a phenomenon everyone feels the same way, regardless of age, gender, cultural background, or social class. So just as a reminder, if you were here for the first flow book, in that initial research, MC did research where he was literally examining and asking questions for people all around the globe, all different sorts of cultures, economic class, different ages, as he points here, different genders, and recognizing that there was this commonality in what people expressed when they talked about the moments when they felt most engaged, most alive, when they felt that things were most worthwhile. And the interesting thing that MC recognized, that perhaps unexpectedly or paradoxically, that when people reported the most happiness and satisfaction, it wasn't in moments of leisure. It wasn't when you were just mindlessly watching TV. Like you might think like, you spent all day at work and it was a lot of drudgery and you can't wait to get home and just veg out on the couch and do nothing. But it turns out that that's not what actually produces happiness and satisfaction in life. That what actually gives people this sense of satisfaction as well as full engagement in the present moment is when we are involved in a task that is challenging, but doable, something that stretches us to our limits and feels worthwhile. So that's what flow is all about. And then he's going to give us here the 8 elements of flow. You want to go through this part, Maritza?
Sure. So I found it interesting that in this book, they're rearranged a little differently, but they're the same 8 elements that he presented to us in his first book on flow. And so here we have number 1, clear goals and immediate feedback. And what he's saying to us for this is that an objective is distinctly or should be distinctly defined, and that one should know instantly how well one is doing. So you want like immediate feedback. For 2, balance between challenges and skills. So that's that sweet spot. We've been talking to you every week, well, every session for this book and the previous book. This is what we come back to time and time again. To me, of all of the elements, this one is the most vital and the easiest to wrap our mind around and to keep with us for everything we do. The idea is that if you don't find a good balance between challenges and skills, you cannot enter into flow state. So we have to find that sweet spot. And we're going to go into that in more detail after we go through these 8 elements. So the third one is action and awareness are merged. And this is like you have that single-minded focus. The 4th is increase in concentration. Distractions disappear from consciousness. And that means that you are concentrating on a task at hand. Any irrelevant stimuli is going to just disappear from your consciousness. And you're also going to find that any worries or any concerns are going to be temporarily suspended while you're in flow state. The 5th element is a sense of potential control. And that one's fairly self-explanatory. The 6th is a loss of self-consciousness, a transcendence of ego boundaries. This one is, to me, one of the most baffling, perhaps, but really awesome concepts. The idea that we're going to have a sense of growth and feel like we're being part of a greater entity, but it's more like you're going to feel that. You're not actually thinking that because you've lost any self-consciousness. The 7th element is an altered sense of time. And we're all familiar of when we're doing something enjoyable, we're like, oh man, time just flew by. That's what we're talking about here. And the 8th element is that the activity becomes an end in itself. So it is, and so the experience becomes autotelic. So it's one of those things like if several of the previous conditions are present, then what you're doing becomes autotelic. And then you're not doing it to get to the next step. You're doing it just for doing it and the pleasure of doing it.
Exactly.
Shall I move us on to
Yeah,
the next
let's
slide?
get to,
okay.
No, because I think the next one even just gives us some more detail about flow here and the whole idea of the flow channel and the challenge skills balance here. So if you've joined us for any of our previous meetups, you probably are familiar with this graph. This one, I think, just gives us the visual of the goal here, what we're trying to get with flow, the flow channel. So flow is considered this perfect sweet spot between your challenges and your skills. So if the challenge isn't high enough, you would experience just boredom, loss of interest, dull routine. But if the challenge is too high, higher than your skills and abilities, you'll experience another set of negative emotions, which would be anxiety or frustration or fear of failure. So we want to hit this perfect sweet spot with our challenges and our skills, where the skills that we have meet the challenge. And usually it's like the challenge is just like slightly ahead of our skills so that we really have to push ourselves, but that ultimately it is doable. And one of the things that this graph is showing us is that this flow channel is itself a growing, evolving process. And this we all probably just know from experience. Let's say you're attempting something you've never done before, let's say trying to learn a new musical instrument. And of course, at the beginning, you have absolutely no skills. So even just, basic elements would be really challenging. But you practice for a couple weeks and you start to develop skills. And all of a sudden, the things you were learning in your first lesson are just a piece of cake. And if your teacher just had you repeat that over and over again, you'd be in this, what here is represented by A2, where everything is just boring and too easy, and you wouldn't feel fully engaged. You wouldn't really be enjoying it. So then you need to up the challenge. Now, if you up the challenge too much, if they suddenly ask you to start playing, Chopin right off the gate, then you would just feel, the anxiety, the stress of all that. But ideally, you challenge yourself just enough that you then get back into the flow channel, which here is represented by A4, where again, where your skills are meeting the challenge at hand. And so, what this graph is suggesting to us is that we want to arrange our lives to ideally continually be putting ourselves as much as possible into this flow channel. It's not only how we experience pleasure and joy and fulfillment on a moment to moment basis, it's also how we continue to grow ourselves over time.
Something else you see here in this graph is it shows you two things: the iterativeness of this process. This is a lifelong process. Okay, I lied. Three things I want to mention: the iterativeness, and also the intentionality required, because there are often times when one can sit at A1 and be perfectly happy and comfortable. Or maybe happy is the wrong word, but one can be comfortable and you're technically in the flow channel. Now you would slide out of A1 and find yourself in A2. Routine's not terrible. It's not super exciting, but it's okay. And you can just stay in a routine and kind of float along in a routine. But you're not in flow. So what is required of you is to listen to yourself. Kind of look at your consciousness and how it's being fed, as it were, and make the decision to move toward and move upward, find yourself back into the flow state, the flow channel. So it requires an action on your part to move back into this state. Now, that's not always necessarily true, or that's not always necessary for entering in flow. All of us humans enter into flow naturally at various different points in our life for various reasons. What MC is saying to us here is that what we're wanting is to find ways to encourage increased flow states. And while he doesn't state that we can stay in flow always without ever falling out of it, what he's saying is if we can be more mindful and more intentional, well, then we can take actions that will encourage us to slip into that flow channel more often. And why would we want to do that? Again, because when you're in this flow state, you're being more productive. So this, the sense of loss of self-consciousness, loss of the ego, it's one of the concepts that I had never previously thought about in the manner in which MC presents it to us. And I find it a fascinating concept that you have to lose the self in order to improve the self. And as I, ponder about that more and more, it's this concept of letting go. Like, sometimes you have to destroy something in order to build and create something brand new. Like there are buildings that, a dilapidated building. Sometimes the answer is to do an overhaul of the building. give it new features, new this, a gut job and redo. But sometimes it's so bad that it's actually more beneficial to just raise it to the ground and put a brand new structure where it once stood. That's what this model here is inviting us to consider. And it points to, so I feel like I've gone a little bit off topic here, but the idea of the self, because ultimately what MC is telling us is that we're seeking ways to improve flow. So if we're trying to have more flow moments, then we have to check in with ourselves continually and see where we fall in this graph and where we need to move if a move is required. And I really like that from the concept also, because when you're not in flow, we're human. It's near impossible to think of anything without the self being a part of it. So I really like the concept that there exists moments in our life where the self naturally falls away. And in so doing, it comes back, or when you are no longer in the flow state, the self comes back stronger. And I think we may get into it a little bit more in some of the other slides. All right, Joya, shall I move on?
Yeah. So let's even get into the rest of the chapter here, because you're right. I think we're gonna explore these ideas even more as the chapter continues here. So in this next section, we're going to talk about why is flow rewarding, which perhaps a kind of obvious point. Flow, as we talked about, one of the elements of flow is that he uses that word autotelic, that it's an end in itself, that it's something you do, an activity that you get involved in for the pleasure of doing the activity. But there's a little bit more to explore here to really tease out why is flow rewarding. So the main point here, the connection between flow and enjoyment may have been at first a fortunate genetic accident, but once it occurred, it made those who experience it much more likely to be curious, to explore, to take on new tasks, and develop new skills. And this creative approach, motivated by the enjoyment of facing challenges, might have conferred so many advantages that with time, it spread to the majority of the human population. So this is, I think, even his theory about why flow developed evolutionarily and why it caught on and spread as humanity continued to evolve. This idea that precisely because what flow encourages us to do is to face our challenges and find enjoyment in our challenges, that it sparks people to do all of these things that lead us to be better humans and create better lives, to be curious, to explore, to take on new tasks, to solve problems and develop new skills, to be creative. What I hear, like the last point says, whenever we discover new challenges, whenever we use new skills, we feel a deep sense of enjoyment. To repeat this desirable feeling, we must find ever higher challenges, build more sophisticated skills. In doing so, we help the evolution of complexity move along one more step. So this is maybe even suggesting how flow itself is part of this whole evolutionary process.
And I think here is where we finally get to the point of this book. He set the stage, 5 laborious chapters we all walked through together for this slide here, when he's trying to tell us that this is what we can do. This is how we're going to improve, because he explained to us in detail what complexity meant and why we cared about complexity, and now he's tying it together, because complexity for the consciousness, for the individual consciousness, will translate to complexity of evolution.
So next, we're going to talk about the consequences of flow, the many reasons why experiencing flow is beneficial. And as he says here, perhaps the most important is also the most obvious. The quality of life depends on it. Increased flow spurs us into increased areas that improve our lives in an overall sense. And so here and in this chapter, he listed out several benefits that we get from flow: creativity, peak performance, talent development, improved productivity, improved self-esteem. Are there any of these that you really wanted to highlight and focus on, Maritza?
I had not thought about which one would be um, the one that jumped out at me. If you have one that jumps out at you, go ahead and I'll be ready when you're done.
So I'll just share this. This one was interesting to me in that in the contemporary 2020s context, it seems to me a lot of people are most interested in flow because of peak performance and productivity. There's a lot of interest in using flow as a way to make us be better at the work that we do. And it makes sense in just that, work obviously takes up so much of our time. And especially in the modern context, it's so easy to get overwhelmed and burnt out by all of the demands of work. This is something I think, cultural commentators have been remarking on for a while now, how as we develop technologically more and more, it seems to add extra pressure, even post the pandemic when people are always working from home. It's like you never have an off switch. So there's a lot of interest in people, I think, with these elements of peak performance and productivity and how flow can be used for that. The one that I even found personally though the most interesting were even the first and the last, which often don't get talked about as much, but creativity was the one that I think interested MC the most. From my understanding, that was even how he discovered flow. That his original research was he had made the connection of recognizing that people were happy when they were creative, and so he was starting to do all this research about creativity, and that was even how my understanding of how he even essentially stumbled upon flow as one of the elements of creativity. And he has a whole book all about creativity. And then I also really like the last one as well, thinking more broadly about how flow helps us with our whole sense of self. I mean, and this gets back to even the points that Marissa was already making, thinking about this paradoxical thing that happens with our sense of self when we are in flow, that we lose our sense of self, and that it is simultaneously in losing our sense of self that we are able to grow ultimately in the complexity of the self. So when I think of this, to me, this is very resonant when I think of my own flow experiences. It's precisely those moments when I've been so absorbed in the task that, like, for me, it's like, I forget that, like, I have to use the bathroom. I forget that I haven't eaten all day, and I'm starving. But that part of my brain that's kind of always monitoring and perhaps always critical kind of shuts off because I'm just so involved in whatever it is that's going on, that in the moment I lose my sense of self. And that it's precisely in these moments when you temporarily lose your sense of self because you are so absorbed and invested in whatever it is that you're doing, that the long run output of that is that those are the moments that precisely help you to, in the long run, grow in complexity of yourself.
No, the creativity aspect was one that was interesting to me because it's funny because it seems such a simple concept, but basically what he's saying is like, well, when you're starting upon something new that's never been done before, you're exercising creativity to do it. But why would you do it when usually it's so frustrating? And obviously he's telling us, it's because of the satisfaction, and the satisfaction, i.e. flow. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So that's another way of showing us how the flow and flow state ties in with this concept of evolutionary, forward movement. Because what he's saying to us is that you're not necessarily thinking of evolution. you're thinking of that satisfaction you're going to get from creating this new improved thing. But it just so happens that this new and improved thing is, an evolutionary benefit. And I think that you can see that in so many of these. And this is actually not the last one. There's two more on the next page. But in all of these that he's identified, that is the common theme that I did see, that he's not saying it directly, but indirectly, what he's saying is that these benefits, or these, he calls them consequences, which I thought was very odd, because usually when I think consequence, I think negative. But he's telling us, and I like it because almost it's like he's saying a byproduct of doing these things, and or when these things are a byproduct of intentionally seeking to be more in a flow state. And that byproduct of creativity, peak performance, talent development, of all these things, that byproduct propels us into a better evolutionary track. So I thought that was very sneaky of him and very well done. And I'm with Joya. The self-esteem aspect is the one that is most fascinating to me. I just keep thinking about how interesting it is that you forget yourself and then you come back a new and improved self. I think that's just great.
Yeah, well, let's get to those last two as well. The last two I kind of think is like the health ones, because it's stress reduction, right, and the clinical applications. So these are just the last two consequences, he calls them. I like your words a little better, the byproducts of flow. Yeah, right. Stress reduction, which obviously makes us much healthier. I think we all know that stress is one of the leading contributors, if not direct causes, of all sorts of the worst diseases, especially that affect us here in the modern age. And then just other clinical applications in psychotherapy as well.
Right. Under the section for clinical applications, he goes and he spends quite a bit of time talking about experience sampling method. And he's talking about, this was a theory based on, it's the principles of, the application of optimal experience theory in psychotherapy. And he says it's centered on reinforcing both the patient's personal search for challenging possibilities for action in daily life and his or her effort to develop personal skills in order to meet these challenges and not to avoid them. So it's interesting because what they're saying is, he says such a therapeutic approach is individualized. So, it focuses on personal motivation and tendencies of the subject. And I find that is it is very practical, but it also gives, or it reinforces the idea of finding that sweet spot. Like even in something like psychotherapy, they're saying, if you find yourself in one of these untenable states of consciousness, let us focus on challenging possibilities, skills, improvements, and let's see if we can move you into a state of consciousness that is more pleasurable, or that is not causing all of these negative things that you're experiencing right now. And I think that's just a fascinating thing to do. And it calls also for us to do it for ourselves personally. Like if you sit down and you think about, if I have this negative feeling, like say, for example, you're exercising and you've been exercising super hard, weight training for an entire month. You look in the mirror, you're like, okay, but I have this bloated stomach. What's happening? You can kind of troubleshoot and look and see what you're doing. Maybe you're too focused on one type of exercise. And if you could identify that, you can set yourself up a plan of action to try something different. Maybe what you needed was some cardio mixed in with that weight training. And then you can try that in the next 4 weeks, and maybe you'll find improvement. And that's a really simplified example, But I really think that's what he's saying here. So I really appreciate the time he took to spell that out for us, because he also does, if you have a time and you hadn't yet had a chance to read the chapter, he does spend some time here given very specific examples. And the example is excellent for showing you just what he means by, evaluating your state of consciousness from an experience sampling methodology. It's really quite fascinating. Joya, are you really familiar with that? Like, I'm not. I just know what
Yeah.
he's shown us.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the part of the chapter that I'm most familiar with, because so
Me neither.
MC was obviously in the field of psychology. That was his profession. So I feel like in this section he's giving us a little bit of professional insight, the sort of insider baseball, but I guess it's maybe like insider psychotherapy. But it's not something that I'm that as familiar with, unfortunately.
Yep. Me neither. All right.
But it was an
So,
interesting glimpse. I agree.
indeed. All right. We get more consequences on the next slide of a different sort.
Yes, now we're going to see what happens when flow is absent. And here we're going to get into this idea of becoming addicted to flow. And there's an idea that's talked about now. It's not really in this book, but a lot of the scholars who even came after MC have recognized this phenomenon that now frequently gets called the dark side of flow. Then there's many ways that we've been discussing all the ways in which flow is almost obviously beneficial to us as individuals and to the species and to evolution. But there are ways that flow can go wrong and flow can go bad. One of the things we're going to talk about a little bit more is even maybe what happens when you get addicted to flow. But that said, there's still this whole other point about like what happens when there is no flow. And as he points out here, when flow is absent, people are drawn to activities that are wasteful or destructive. And in such cases, the result of seeking enjoyment is entropy rather than harmony. So here again, we're pointing out the benefits of flow. And here he's connecting it again with this idea of complexity and growth, that what we're getting through flow is what he describes here as harmony. It's what leads us to be more integrated and not just devolve into entropy. And so here, as he points out here, all evidence agrees. So when people in flow act at the peak of their capacity, it both improves subjective well-being and has the potential for socially positive consequences. In each case, flow seems to be the engine of evolution, propelling us to higher levels of complexity. So here again, he's pointing out that flow almost seems to be this necessary component for how we achieve happiness and well-being, both individually and as a society, both in the present, here and now, and in the future going forward. But then the last point here is that when you kind of don't when flow kind of can go wrong, or when you don't have flow, like the harmful consequences, the way that flow can be dangerous, as it says here, when it doesn't stretch skills or lead to complexity, or when it becomes physiologically addictive, and then it can cause entropy to individuals and groups.
Right. And here for this section, it's the I like the introduction of the word, or maybe the tying in of the I guess he calls them antonyms, entropy and harmony. Again, they seem easy words for us to remember as we're kind of going forth and doing our own little, consciousness self checks. And I like so he talks here in this section about, and there's not too much on the slide, but he does talk about how today's society, he says it is no exaggeration to say that a great many of our social problems are due to the lack of flow in everyday life. So he believes that we are increasingly becoming a society devoid of plentiful opportunities for entering into the flow state. And worse than that, he also believes that we have increasing opportunities for artificially induced flow. So, it's the idea here is that he's saying we may find ourselves in a society where what people think is flow is actually an artificial type of flow, which doesn't have any of the benefits that he was describing in the previous section. And so he goes about it, he says, he also reminds us, we spoke about memes and genes and all of that in the previous 5 chapters. And he's telling us, our culture too has been parasitized by memes that mimic the appearance of flow, but do not produce its benefits. And he points out recorded music, videos, TV, movies, pulp fiction, sleazy magazines. And what he's saying, the problem with these is that they're soaking up an enormous amount of attention. And they're producing a semblance of excitement in the mind. But to the extent that they do not require skills of any kind, they take up energy without increasing complexity. So that's the danger. And so the idea of being addicted to flow from a species perspective is only problematic if the flow that we're focusing on is an artificial flow. And that's where he's telling us, that deeply satisfying experiences are what we're going to derive from real challenges of everyday life, from work, from creative expression, from family relationships, and from friendship. But if we can't find these opportunities and these challenges, we're going to invest in substitutes or even like chemical substitutes that will project phantasms of flow onto our consciousness. And what he's telling us here is that as more and more individuals do this, well, then our opportunities for a good evolutionary track become slimmer and slimmer. And that's the danger that I see him identifying here.
And when he was writing this in the mid-90s, he didn't even have at all our current experience of the internet, social media scrolling, which I think, at this point we all know is even designed to get us all sucked into that immediate moment. And so much of social media scrolling it contains all of those elements of the flow experience where you get so involved, people lose track of time. They don't realize they've just spent, 3 hours scrolling through their feed. They probably lose their sense of self. They're totally absorbed in the present moment. But again, and of course it has all of these kind of addictive elements, but as MC would point out here, it doesn't do anything to stretch our skills, and not to mention everything else that the internet makes available. I think about the people that get, let's say, even addicted to porn that's so readily available through the internet, or, just all the ways that we can go down rabbit holes and the ways that people just become tied to their, these devices that we carry around with us all the time. So it's almost prescient and prophetic what he was writing in the mid-90s, in thinking about, and this, I think we just got back to a point that Maritza was making earlier when we were first examining the idea of the flow channel and about why it's so important to be intentional about flow, to make sure that we're actually going to engage in flow activities that do stretch ourselves and lead to growth, both for ourselves and for society as well. And so now we're finally getting into flow in everyday life. So it's the last of the sections of the chapter here. And the main point here is that individuals who cannot experience flow or who enjoy only passive and simple activities end up developing selves that are often in turmoil, driven by frustration and disappointment. Those who master enough skills to find flow in more complex activities tend to develop selves that can transform everyday events, even when these threaten to bring chaos and entropy in their wake, into meaningful experiences. In so doing, they not only enjoy their own lives, but they contribute to the evolution of complexity for humanity as a whole. So here again, I think this is the main point that he really wants to convey to us in this chapter of thinking about how when we are intentional about transforming our everyday experiences into true flow experiences, that this is precisely what helps us bring meaning and growth into our own lives. And even though we're not even recognizing it in that moment, that it's also producing this development of growth and complexity for humanity as a whole.
So in this section, I again, I feel like this was a long build up to get to this. So this slide and the slide on where he's talking about, he's connecting the dots between evolution. These are very exciting to me because I'm finally seeing, okay, this is the heart of why he wrote this book. I had to slug through all the depressing chapters that came before so I can get to this, and I know that the major point here is super long, but I just felt like it was so necessary.
It almost, I think, is the point of the whole book. So if you had made the whole slide about it, I think that would have been perfectly fine. I think you actually did a very good job of shortening it, frankly.
Great. I feel good. That makes me feel so much better because that was yes, that was exactly it. I agree entirely with what Joy just said, that this is the point. And then this is one major point. And then when you extrapolate this, tie it in to evolution by looking at this and thinking about, in so doing, they not only enjoy their own lives, but they contribute to they contribute to the evolution of complexity for humanity as a whole. That one line is it. It's the entire point of this book. If we ran away and decided not to read one more sentence, that's the point he wants us to ponder, to consider, and to walk with. And I really love that line because what it's saying is that as we intentionally focus on ourselves and on wrangling a little bit of control of our consciousness in order to do things that are going to make us, all those 8 things, the creativity, the peak performance, the development of our tasks and productivity, and increasing our self-esteem and reducing the stress. We're doing those for us, right? I'm not going to worry about reducing my stress for Joya. What does Joya care if I reduce my stress? But ultimately, my being able to reduce my stress and to be more productive may enable me somehow, in some way, to contribute something into the universe that will benefit Joya's future children or Joya's grandchildren. And that's kind of a really heady concept, isn't it? It's that idea of interconnectedness, which we really do discuss and think about so often here at 52 Living Ideas. How, everything you touch touches something else. Like it's almost impossible to touch any one thing without touching anything else. And that's basically what he's saying here. And I love it. I love the idea that improve yourself, improve the individual, because in so doing, you're giving evolution a shot for more complexity. Really like that. And this is actually the last slide, Joya.
I would say that was just a beautiful summary of what we've been discussing here. So the next part of our meeting, this is typically the section where we put you all into breakout rooms and give you a question to explore. But we have such a small group today, I think we'll just do the question that we have here with everyone who's here today. And then after we explore, and Maritza actually came up with a really great question for you all. So if you've been reading along in the book with us, you would know that MC ends all of these chapters with further thoughts and questions about the chapter that we just read. But Maritza took some inspiration from MC here and came up with her own questions. So I'll let her ask that question. We can explore it as the group here. And then once we're done with that, there'll be an opportunity for all of you, if you want to ask any of your own questions or contribute any of your own takeaways. And we'll probably end up even finishing up earlier. So there'll be plenty of time for you to log off. And right after this, there is another 52 Living Ideas meetup all about the Bhagavad Gita. So I'll have plenty of time to get prepared for that one.
Yeah, and I might want to also throw up on the screen Shrikant's latest baby and talk about it with flow in mind. He doesn't usually bring flow up when he talks about all the interconnectedness. So I want to cheat.
Ooh, so maybe so because we have a small group, I'll say, why don't we do we can put out like two things. We can put out your question, the one that you came up with, which I really like, and then you can do this little presentation too.
Right.
And then we'll do everybody's takeaways and
absolutely. We'll do the question first, and then we'll ask you to look at that from that perspective. So first, what we're looking at, the question is flow that becomes negative or actively non-conduct. Is flow that becomes negative or addictive not conducive to evolutionary growth? Would any of you guys like to chime in on your thoughts on that? Maybe you can start us off, Joya.
I know. So when you even asked it, I liked it because, it makes me think about, especially in the contemporary context, all of the kinds of activities that so many people get absorbed with, the kind of addictive negative flow, like the social media scrolling, and then to your question, your point here, like, to what extent does that take away from perhaps people's abilities to evolve both personally and for humanity as a whole? And for my answer, I mean, I just try to think about the ways that I have had to be intentional, say, about social media in my own life, because there's definite ways in which social media has benefited my life. I'm even reading this book. I'm old enough to have been a teenager in the 90s, so have distinct memories of what life was like in the 90s when this book came out, and can think of all of the many ways that social media has legitimately benefited my life, just in the ability to connect with people and stay in touch with people and just get exposed to new ideas, and just how easy that is, and how much benefit that brings to my life. So there's clearly a way in which I can see how I have personally been able to evolve because of something like the development of social media. But at the same time, I recognize that I get those benefits only when I'm really being intentional about social media, when I'm really being intentional about where I'm going on the platform, or how much time that I'm spending on the platform. So I guess my answer to this would be to say that I would say that to me is the key about this, is really having to add this concept of intentionality, to making sure that I really am focused on the actual benefits and not just getting sidetracked by all of the potential negatives. I'm curious to hear how you answer your own question, but maybe first we'll let is it Rogine? Am I
Rogine, definitely.
Rogine,
yeah.
correctly?
Hi, I'm sorry my camera is not working.
Oh, that's okay.
But, it seems to me, now I'm retired, but used to manage a lot of people over decades, and it certainly seems to me that the what would it be, a careless use of flow? Does that sort of fit what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Is making people less interesting and lower skilled, or much more narrow in the kind of skills they have, because they've been forced to for a job, and a lot less interesting people, and that can't be good for social evolution. Can't be good at all.
I really like your use of the word interesting. MC always uses the word like complexity. That's I think his big word that he's always focused on. But interesting is even a word that I think gets to this same idea that when we develop skills, when we become more complex, we become more interesting, and
Yeah.
that's precisely what we've lost, perhaps, or are in danger of losing.
I think if you ask, I'm not sure, if you ask more people if they'd like to be more interesting, they'd say yes. If they'd like to be more complex, I'm not so sure. That has a funny meaning, unpredictable meaning, I think, in our culture. Yeah, especially when it borders on psychology.
That's a fascinating, I'd never thought about that the very word complexity might scare people off from being complex. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. So let's see. The question is, so welcome, Mike. Oh, he's still connected audio. So we're looking, I have a question, a follow-on question to Rogine. So it's a fantastic point that we live in a society where ever increasingly people may find themselves in jobs where they have to, only focus on a very small subset of skills. I am of the mind that not necessarily does that mean that one is limited in what type of skills one can improve upon. What if, so if one has a job that we find to be rote or routine, that would mean, if that's the case, it means that we find ourselves on this, in the graph, we're going to find ourselves in A2, right? So you're going to be, or even in A3 where you're, well, not A3, you'll find yourself in A2 where once you've learned a skill, you're just doing it over and over. You might be a little bored, it's routine. If you're there and you're seeking some excitement, you may start going to the casinos, right? So now you're going to the casinos and you're engaging in some gambling. Every now and again, casino, sure, you're doing it for fun. But now if you start doing this, like you have to do it every day and you spend all day while you're doing your routine job thinking about going to the casino. Now we're entering into a slightly addictive behavior and it may not be conducive. So if we're asking ourselves, so maybe you were in a flow state when you're shaking that dice and you're getting the, I don't know anything about gambling, so I don't even know what it's called. You're shaking the dice and you're getting the right double numbers and you're, whatever, and you're winning, right? So you're getting this little positive feedback and then it's all good, right? And even if you lose, it's just a little bit, so you're doing. But then if you start becoming dependent upon this to feel good and everything else kind of just doesn't compare to pale emotion. And this is the only arena in which you find yourself feeling this good feeling, this, you think you're in flow, like, time is passing by, you're just, if we look at something like that, a scenario like that, and how do we, so it's asking the question, is flow that becomes negative or addictive not conducive to evolutionary growth? Well, this is a simple explanation, a simple example. So it would give us the very simple no. But my question would be, and because you brought it up, Rogine, I don't mean to be picking on you, but I was just going to ask you, do you believe necessarily that one is doomed because one has a job where one cannot find themselves in the flow state? And this is out of curiosity, because I'm curious to see what other people think or not. And I can throw the graph up just real quick for you if you'd like.
Well, if we had shorter work weeks, I think people would be more able to develop other interests. And so whatever flow they can get into in their job isn't the only area where they can do that. Yeah, I certainly saw that with younger people when I was managing them. We tried hard to go to like 4-day longer work days, and people got other interests, which I suspect, well, that was new skills. The example of the casino, I'm glad you brought that up because it makes me think most of my background was people with mathematical and statistical skills. And gambling did become an issue because in terms of probability, it's so challenging and so interesting that a statistician or a probabilityist can easily get sucked into that, thinking, oh, if I just think through where the conditional probabilities are, and I suspect in other fields there are the same kinds of dangers, and that one in particular, but the same kinds of people I saw when they're not really challenged or are really trying to be more social, which doesn't always come naturally to mathematical or IT nerds. There was a real tendency to lead to drinking too much. Being under challenged maybe leads to really unhealthy ways of pursuing other skills without a clear goal. Like I said before, without a purpose other than be more social.
Interestingly, what you're pointing out to me is that maybe our question it's the wrong question. That's funny. I'm.
Oh.
Well, let me just off the cuff thoughts is what I'm thinking here is that what you're describing is that more pressing than the idea of flow becoming negative or addictive is the concept of when we are outside the parameters of the flow channel. So if we find ourselves in A2 or A3, I have arrows pointing towards A4 so that we can keep getting ourselves in the flow channel. But you're saying that increasingly in our society, the perception is that we cure boredom or ennui or anxiety or frustration by grabbing an artificial form of flow. I had not considered that.
Well, I couldn't have stated it that way, but yeah, that's what I think I mean. Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, I guess that really even gets into the dangers of flow, right? Because so like your graph is showing that, we're always, the goal is to try to get back into the flow channel, but there's different kinds of flow. So,
Indeed.
Are we going into getting into flow in a way that actually benefits both ourselves as individuals and society and the future?
It makes me think of, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about this.
This one.
The background here is actually another way of showing
the flow channel.
The question of the flow state. And here we're just showing you the various states or some various states of consciousness. So it's interesting. You've given me.
I mean, if you go back to that other
Sorry.
that other graph, I mean, so one of the interesting things here is that this perhaps even shows the ways when you're not in good flow, how it can kind of go wrong. So like, everything sort of on the left-hand bottom part of the screen, the anxiety, worry, apathy, boredom, those are sort of all the bad things. And then as we're kind of going in toward flow, we get to arousal, relaxation, control. These are the kinds of things that we would get from going to the casino, going out to the bar, scrolling through social media, but they're not yet, and then there are things that are potentially more positive, arousal, control, relaxation. These all, they have positive connotations to them, but they're not yet the actual good flow that, as MC says, makes us more complex, or as Rojin says, makes us more interesting, and actually furthers our development and growth.
And also it's interesting here to note that the opposite of flow is apathy. And I can't think of anything more or any impediment greater to evolutionary growth than apathy. So there's that to chew on. Okay, so
did you want to turn to your other
sure. I wish I had I was gonna message Shrikant and I forgot to, just to see if he wanted to hop on. But okay, so we're going.
He's probably busy getting ready for the next one anyway. Like I think he
right, probably, but I would just get to give him the opportunity so he so choose. All right, guys. So what I'm gonna do here is this is an unsanctioned activity. I did not get permission to do this. And I don't know how
need permission.
I don't know how he feels about it in either direction. Actually, first, before I do that, Marco, you were here. I just wanted to see if you wanted to chime in on this chapter. Did you want to talk about the question about flow becoming, if flow becomes negative or addictive, is it not conducive to evolutionary growth? Give you the mic, so to speak, really quickly before I move on.
Yeah, I actually think it was already like mentioned where, if maybe work, like if you get flow from work, then, you're sort of like spending less time with your family or, so I guess that's sort of like a negative. I think that was already discussed anyway.
Okay. All right, great. I just thank you. Okay,
that guys, is a good point too, that like even things that are positive, like, in the long run, seemingly positive, like getting flow at work, can also be negative if it means that you're just avoiding all the other aspects of your life.
So true. Yeah, I do. I like, when we're looking at all the different states of consciousness, the ones closer to flow were the positive ones, but it should be noted that every one of them has the potential for a negative side if taken to the extreme. So, and that leads nicely to, my favorite thought, that everything in moderation, right? Because even the healthiest thing, if taken to an extreme, can have its negative effects.
I think that's especially true in an environment where competition is lurking in the background anyway. Attorneys trying to get the partnership, or academics trying to get tenure, or things like that. If someone can get into flow and stay there and work too much, it puts pressure on everybody around them. A sort of unhealthy level of flow can create a really unpleasant competitive environment. I've been in those environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To me, it almost sounds like, it's like you're upping the challenge too much, like you're.
Yeah. And living a very unhealthy life.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Yep.
for it to be that extreme. Yeah. If I don't know if I want to say if we have time. I didn't make it to all the previous sessions, but I have a question that's really important to me. I'm bipolar, and in the book, has he mentioned anything about that? I spent the first 50 years of my life in flow because I was manic. And no, up to a point, it doesn't seem that different. It just has more unpleasant consequences, followed usually by eventually a crash. Has he mentioned that at all? It's very confusing to me.
In this book, he has not. In the first book, he's very careful to state that if one finds oneself in an he does not use that word. I don't remember the exact word he uses, but if he says if one finds oneself in a state of consciousness that would not be considered a normative state, then it would be more difficult to look at the flow with the lens that he was applying to it. I think he's very careful to state it. Now, he himself has a psychotherapy background, so he's careful not to make any definitive statements in any direction. But I know he does mention it in the first book. Just so you know, that we do post all of our sessions online in YouTube under 52 Living Ideas. So it wouldn't be this book. This book here is The Evolving Self.
Right.
I don't have the other book right with me, but it's Flow. It's Flow. Oh, Joey has got it. Optimal Experience. I always forget the rest of it. It's really long.
Oh, that's it. It's Flow. It's Psychology of Optimal Experience. Yeah, it's the one that I reference a lot. I'll see if I can find where he talked about it. Let me look and see if I can.
Right.
Chapter
So that's
and we could direct you which one to go to.
Awesome.
Let me see if I can find it.
So yes. So in this one we don't, because this one is focusing on, evolution and ourselves and how flow ties into our ability for increased evolution. And MC actually is going so far as to state that our future survival depends on wrangling our consciousness to have increased flow states.
Yeah, I'm most interested in that. This has been great.
Welcome. Glad to have you.
Given the bipolar tendency to like to be in flow, I get very deeply into a few topics, and it can't do everything. So yeah.
Right. We do. We're here at 52 Living Ideas. We like the idea of comprehensivity. So on that note,
that leads you into, I think, what you want to talk about, right?
It does, right? So, okay. So again, disclaimer. Are you seeing the, it looks kind of star-like? Yep. Okay. So disclaimer, guys, this is not my graph. This is Shrikant's graph. He actually shared it with me in a, private email. He's been talking about it at other
He's done meetups though about this, so
he has done meetups out there. Definitely go onto YouTube if you're curious more about it. So I will not claim to have all the answers. What I would like to do here is I'm throwing it up here because I'd like to look at it through the lens of the concepts of flow. So just a very, very quick synopsis for those of you who are not familiar with this graph or hexagon. He's looking at this as a potential philosophy of life. And what he's saying is that this is a three-dimensional moving model, and the feelings, thoughts, and actions are a periphery of inner. Interactions, expressions, and tasks are a periphery of outer. The triangles on the outermost edge If you see them, they're pointing out, so they're going outward. The triangles inner are going inner. Center is like, that would be your goal, your purpose is center. So as you travel from thoughts towards your purpose, your thoughts are gonna become a little bit more like wisdom, right? And so that's a really high level concept here. And Csikszentmihalyi believes that this can be applied to just about any aspect or facet of life, culture, society. And he's doing kind of a testing, stress testing. So in the interest of stress testing, let's look at this from the idea of flow. If we're trying to get into flow, how could we potentially use this model to either A, get into flow, or B, check to see if we're in true flow or artificial flow, or C, to find out if we've entered into some type of addictive or negative flow. I'm gonna take a stab, and then I would love to invite you, Joya, to see if you want to do the same, and then anyone else who might feel inclined. Because I've been looking at this a lot the last couple of days. What I see here is that when we are in the outer edges, when we're looking, so just one more thing I'd like to share with you. Csikszentmihalyi looks at, expressions would be also, that's like art. Interactions are like family, friends, and tasks, actions are kind of more like, the economy. And in the top, you would also have, you're looking more at the heart. The mind is up here. Mind is thoughts, heart, around there. So when we're in the peripheries, I would think that's where you have the flow states that happen naturally. As we've spoken about before, flow happens to all of us at some point in our lives with no effort of our own. It just happens naturally. You find yourself magically in that state. What MC is inviting us to do is to enter, or to wrangle our consciousness so that we can have increased times where we find ourselves in a flow state. And he's saying, if you can take some control over your consciousness, you can put yourself in the right setup to have more flow. That's where the hexagon aspect to me comes in. So you see this thick grayish line here where it looks hexagonal. As we move along these lines towards the center, which is the goal, or your philosophy, if you're a religious person, it could even be your religion. As we move that way, now we're moving from flow that just happens to seeking to make flow happen. So when random feelings are making you in flow, or expressions, if we look at these together, this is art, right? So if I just am scribbling along and I have some time and I decide I'm going to write a poem, and now I've lost 2 hours and I come up with this poem, that was awesome. But I did nothing for that. And it was just nice, right? I'm kind of around here. If I intentionally start setting aside time every day to start journaling and maybe writing something, and it'll be poetry or not. If I start doing that, now I may find myself having more moments of flow, because every time I sit down and I get engaged in this writing process, I fall into flow, because it's already something I enjoy. It's already something that I really like. And so I just fall into it. But now I'm doing the same thing I was doing up here. The difference is up here was random. It was just one day, it was like on a Monday, I had nothing better to do with myself. As I move down here, what moves me and propels me towards here is that now I told myself I would like to do this Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and clear my schedule. Now, of course, we're going to presuppose that my basic needs have been met. I'm fed, I finished work. I had that time anyway. say, for example, maybe I spent an hour. I used to spend that 1 hour watching television. Now I've decided I'm going to spend that 1 hour writing. So I am moving with intention towards more writing. And I'm going to find myself having more moments of flow. So that's how I see this working for us from the perspective of flow. Every one of these outer peripheries, if we take and start moving along the radial lines towards the hexagon, that's the path towards increased states of flow. That's how I view it here. It seems very simple, but it's kind of like, I sometimes like to say, yeah, it's just that easy and it's just that hard, because, it's really easy to say it. It's much harder to walk it. But a thing here that's so clear and visible is this movement, forward movement. In this case, because it is three-dimensional, as you're walking this way, you are walking forward. And it works for all of them. If you're a runner and you find that running gives you flow, if you take the big, tough decision to train for a marathon, that requires courage. But in making the decision to take the courage to do so, your action is going to move you along this axis into here, and you're going to experience greater flow, because not only are you getting flow from the running, you're going to get flow from that satisfaction of getting increasingly closer to the goal of a marathon. So that's how I see this here working. What are your thoughts, Joya?
I really like this. And one of the things I see you pointing out is again, just this power of intentionality, which we come back to all the time. Because what I see you pointing out is that when you're sort of in the outer spokes of the stars, these are sort of the ways that flow can just essentially kind of happen to you without any sort of intention. You kind of talked about, art or running, or like, to me, like even the big one is interactions. I think, group flow and getting into flow by our interactions with people. That's one of like the biggest ways that people get into flow and have the most powerful experiences of flow. And to me, it's one that I think we probably all of us have experienced, where, you run into someone and you just happen to strike up a conversation, and then, all of a sudden you're in flow and time is passing and you've totally lost track of time and such. But that what your diagram is showing here is that we can move from just all of the accidental ways that we get into flow to being intentional about those things. And so what I love about this, two things, I mean, one, it gets us more flow just because we're being intentional about paying attention to what is it that gets us into flow, and then doing more of those things on purpose so that we're moving in toward the center. And the center here, I mean, maybe to connect this with the point we were just making of, how does this tie to evolution and growth? Like, the more we're moving in toward the center, the more we're moving toward growth. So I love that. And then also there's the idea that flow follows focus, that we get into flow when we are so absorbed in the activity. So it strikes me that at a higher level, when we're being intentional about seeking out flow experiences, that almost at a meta level, that helps us get into even more flow, because precisely by being intentional, we're being more focused on the good, on the values that we're trying to get. And so that in and of itself just gives us even more flow. I mean, maybe that's the way, like the hexagon maybe starts moving in a spiral of sorts. I don't know, but that then we're getting into more of even a fourth or fifth dimensional kind of graph.
That's great. I agree entirely. I totally see that. Yes, and it's, if you look at it, the spokes almost give the idea of movement. Like it reminds you that this is moving, and it makes sense because we're, as we're improving ourselves, our communities, there's movement. And I like the reminder that you get the bigger, like, payout, as it were, as you move forward. And that's also true of flow. So would anyone like to chime in here on their thoughts of this? Did what we say make sense to you? Does it jive? Does it connect? And if any of you have seen, so I know that Mike has seen this a hexagonal graph before. Has anyone else, or you don't have to have seen it before. If you want to chime in, please do. We welcome any comments.
Yeah. Any thoughts about how this graph might relate to your understanding of flow? If it does, and maybe it doesn't. So you could think that Maritza and I are just totally wrong.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
I think what you are talking about makes sense, and seems like a product of some flow. And I'm wondering, yeah, I really think it makes sense. I'm wondering if you have to have some flow, or it certainly helps to get to the inner hexagon, which is sort of, yeah, like writing a poem now and then, to start to live with more consciousness of beauty. And I don't know what he calls them, the virtues in the hexagon. I think it makes a lot of sense. That's really.
I mean, my immediate thought to that is, I'm not sure if you necessarily have to have flow, but it would strike me that I think if you're on that path of intentionality of moving toward the hexagon, that flow is definitely just more likely. Just even because you're focused on you, because you have a goal, right? We talked about what was the first thing you need, the elements of flow, is having clear goals. So even just sort of being intentional of moving to, in toward the hexagon, you have a goal, and that's already one of the elements that can help get you into more flow. So it strikes me that flow is maybe not necessary, but increasingly more likely when you're on that path.
Right. And, interesting thing here is like, let's talk about these 8 elements of flow, right? And how do we see them depicted here? I would garner that we do. So first of all, Joya talked about clear goals. Well, remember that clear goals is tied to immediate feedback. Well, and the thing of it here is, if you find yourself out here in the periphery, the direction of the triangle tells you that you're headed more and more into chaos. So that's a very clear and immediate feedback that, oh, I'm moving the wrong way. Let me go back towards this direction. Because towards chaos is less opportunities for entering into flow state. You want to wrangle stuff to get towards here. Second element of flow is balance between challenges and skills. And again, because that's a very intentional thing you're doing, by necessity, you have to be moving this way along any of these axes as you're attempting to move yourself to find that perfect balance. Action and awareness are merged is the third element of flow. And if we're looking at that here, well, there's actually a thing here for action, right? So this one here is interesting, because what we're saying is that there's no actual awareness. You're here and you're only here. So what do you think, Joya?
Well, I mean, so I know that like one of those triangles is actions, but in a sense, they're all actions, right? Interactions, feelings are kind of activity, expressions are activity, thoughts are kind of activity, tasks are obviously kind of activity. So the way I even see it, though, is that the awareness comes because you're, again, being intentional. You're being intentional about moving toward the hexagon. So just even in moving in that direction, that's the way of taking sort of all of these, maybe we could call them acts, maybe action is not the right word, maybe all these different acts. And then by making them more intentional, you are kind of merging the act with the awareness, I would say.
That's great. And so the fourth element of flow is an increase of concentration and the disappearance of distractions from our consciousness. And that's these spoke wheels here, to me, just really bring that home, increase. We already talked about this is where you're going, right? This is God, as it were, philosophy, purpose, goal. So you're going to be moving towards that. You're going to increase your intentionality, increase your concentration. And if this black area is chaos, distractions fall more under chaos. So it makes sense that they're going to disappear, and you get further and further away from them the closer you get to goal.
I mean, this is almost like a colorful visual representation of like moving away from the black of distraction into the rainbow.
I love it.
The
rainbow of flow.
Yes.
And life. So 5 is a sense of potential control. That goes hand in hand with this moving away from the black of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
When, if you stay here in thoughts, oftentimes, our thoughts, they get all jumbled, they get all messed. Sometimes they trip one over the other, and you kind of feel a little lost and hopeless. But as you move towards setting some order to your thoughts, that's how we get to wisdom. And when we find wisdom, we feel, oh, I've learned a little something. So that's an example there of that sense of potential control. When you're having interactions, and then you find yourself in a spot where you can say you actually have this deep sense of interactional glue that we're going to call love, that gives you a little bit of control, because you decide what you're going to apply this moniker of love to. And the same for all of them. When we determine that we're going to have some type of a devotion, say we're talking a religious devotion, feelings are kind of all over the place. Devotion gives it a more centralized focus that you yourself are doing. So that to me really brings about this, this 5th element of flow, of sense of potential control.
Yeah. One thing I'd say about that too is in this book, one of the phrases that MC uses, I don't remember if he used it in this book, but in this book he uses it a lot. He describes flow as precisely as being bringing order to consciousness. And that's exactly what this graph is showing, that you're moving from the chaos and the disorder of the blackness into the order of the beauty of the rainbow of what's possible with consciousness.
The 6th element of flow is loss of self-consciousness and a transcendence of ego boundaries. When we look at that from here, what I want to do is bring up to you something I told Shrikant yesterday. I told him that I saw Shrikant as operating as the gray hexagon at times. And that's where I also see this 6th element. When we go into here, whenever one is inside the hexagon area, we are transcending the more chaotic aspects of ourselves. So we are letting go of these boundaries in order to find something better, or something, that we talked about, that destruction of self consciousness. Like, so, the self goes away when we are in the flow state. And then when it comes back, it's a newer, improved version. And I believe this line here into the hexagon shape shows that beautifully. When we slide from, chaotic feelings into a more, concentrated devotion, again, there's the intentionality. This is the line showing you where intentionality begins and where you're transcending a boundary of, ego, but ego from a negative sense, the chaotic ego, I think. Does that make sense, Joya?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And let's see. So 7 is the altered sense of time. And I think, again, for any of these, because even just looking at them, you think about, devotion, wisdom, prudence, courage, love, beauty. All of these concepts really do bring to mind states that, for which we would say, oh man, I just lost track of time. So that one's fairly self-explanatory. And then the eighth
Because I
element.
want to pause on because that one's kind of really
Sorry.
interesting to me because so in flow we talk about sort of the way that we experience time. So there's an altered sense of time when you're in flow, and sometimes in flow you experience it where like time seems to move too quickly, like like 3 hours go by and feels like 5 minutes, and sometimes it's the reverse. Like this especially happens with people performing really difficult tasks. Like when you see like these athletes who are doing these literal like split second maneuvers, but they're so in the moment that it almost seems like time expands because they're able to just process so much in like no time at all. But to then connect it with this, to what I see here is there seems to be something really interesting with time in this graph between like states that are ephemeral and like characteristics that are timeless. So all the things on the outside of the triangles, like feelings, expressions, thoughts, interactions, actions, tasks, these are all the sort of momentary, as I said, ephemeral. They're measured in time, whereas things like beauty, wisdom, prudence, courage, love, devotion, these are all of these virtues and principles and values that last and have that timeless quality to them. So I'm not sure if it's an exact match, but I think there's something really interesting going on with precisely the way that we perceive and organize time, and then what's happening in flow states.
That's awesome. I like that. I really like that. Well, that gets us to the last element of flow, which is the activity becomes autotelic, or it becomes an end in itself. And that's cool, right? That's where we're seeking.
And even all the things already in the hexagon are things that I would argue, love, beauty, devotion, wisdom, prudence, courage. These are all things that people already pursue as ends in themselves. And then, of course, when you have them all, that's like the ultimate end in itself, is the very center of the circle there.
I like it. So awesome. That's great. I had suspected that the elements of flow fit in here quite nicely. So this was a lot of fun for me. So guys, with the
and it makes a perfect transition to talking about what's coming next, unless you had something else that you wanted to
nope, I was just going to see if anyone else wanted to make any comments here. That's the only thing I was going to say.
Thank you. You described that really well. I really like it.
So I'll just jump in and say here that our next chapter is all about the transcendent self. So I think we're just going to be building on the ideas that we talked about in this chapter. And I think we're going to have reason to probably even bring this graph back into our discussion. And as we think about the nature of the self, this paradoxical idea of we lose the sense of self in order to grow the self as a whole. And I think this graph is probably even, I haven't read the chapter yet. I'm reading this all along with you, but just kind of knowing what I already kind of know about MC and where the direction he seems to be going, I imagine we'll probably even want to bring this graph back into our conversation for next time.
I am going to give you guys a little bit of a teaser, because I read the first couple pages only, but I circled the second paragraph of the first page of next chapter, and it's the perfect teaser, and it's perfect while we still have this graph up. So a little teaser for the chapter on transcendent self. To help guide the process of evolution is not sufficient for a person to enjoy merely any kind of life, but a life that increases order instead of disorder. That's your teaser.
And that is this graph.
Indeed. Anybody else? Marco or Mike, you guys want to chime in here for this, or you guys all set? You don't have to.
If everyone's collecting their thoughts, I just want to circle back to Rogine had asked specifically about, connecting flow with bipolar. And so I was trying to find it in this book. I realized there's actually no index in this book, which is not very helpful. Like, what kind of book doesn't give you, he gives you notes and he gives you like references, but no index. But I did find and recall that it's in chapter 4, which is called The Conditions of Flow, where he does talk about neurophysiology and flow. So that might maybe even give you some insights, maybe not even specifically about, bipolar and manic depression, but, in just that idea of thinking about, neurophysiology and what its connection might be to flow. So that was chapter 4. So, and again, if you go back to the 52 Living Ideas video page, you'll find we did a whole series. We went chapter by chapter. So just look for the video on chapter 4, The Conditions of Flow.
And chapter 4 of which book?
Flow, the psychology of optimal experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You'll probably even see this picture, because I think we used that graph when we were talking about it.
I think I have listened to a couple of them. I will try to catch up. Yeah. And look at the book. Thank you.
Any last thoughts, Maritza, before we sign off for the night?
Let's see. I think leaving you with a Dante quote is appropriate, seeing as MC gave us the Dante quote. Actually, he quoted him twice. I'm going to give you the last one because I really like it. He said, as Dante says, we all desire to be what we are, but are all too often prevented from acting out our being. Oh, that's interesting to me. So this was fun. Thank you guys for giving us a couple of your hours today. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks from today, same time, same channel. I think it's going to be the best one yet, talking about the transcendent self. So I'm really looking forward to it.
I really hope I can make that. I'm really going to try.
I hope so too.
We'd love to have you. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody. And don't forget Bhagavad Gita right after this, but it is a different Zoom link. So I have to switch out into the next one.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.